Have you ever felt invisible despite doing everything right? Imagine being on the verge of achieving your biggest dream, only to have someone in power decide, without reason, that you don't belong. That was Naomi Carter, a 16-year-old black girl stepping onto her first-class flight to represent her country in a global debate. Her ticket, a symbol of years of hard work and parental pride, was torn in front of her by a captain who couldn't see beyond his assumptions. How would you react if the world stared at you while someone questioned your worth simply because of who you are in that moment? Naomi had a choice: crumble under humiliation or stand firm in dignity. But what if it were you, your dreams, your identity, your moment of triumph suddenly challenged by someone else's prejudice? Could you hold your composure, knowing the outcome might change everything? This story is not just about one flight. It's about courage, justice, and the ripple effect of doing what's right even when no one is watching. It asks us to consider our own choices when faced with unfairness and the power of standing tall despite fear. Join us as we follow Naomi's journey from shock to strength, from personal injustice to a movement that changed an entire airline. If you're ready to feel every heartbeat of this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel before we take off. The sound of morning at O'Hare International was its own kind of music, the hum of suitcase wheels, the faint echo of announcements, the hiss of coffee machines. For most travelers, it was noise. For Naomi Carter, it was a promise. 17, bright-eyed, a finalist at the World Youth Speech Championship, she stood at the departure gate of Aurelia Air, Flight 907 Chicago to London. Her fingers gripped the sleek leather strap of her bag, the same one her father had given her when she won her first local debate at 12. He'd said, "Every word you speak carries a piece of where you came from. Naomi, don't waste any of them." Her phone buzzed a video call from her father, Elijah Carter. The screen lit up with his face calm, composed, the kind of man whose presence filled a room even through pixels. Behind him, his office wall showed the Aurelia Air logo, gold wings stretching toward a rising sun. "Mornin', superstar," Elijah said, voice steady as a captain's. "Mornin', Dad, you're not at the airport." He smiled. "Board meeting in New York ran late, but I wouldn't miss sending my co-pilot off." She laughed. "Co-pilot? You're the CEO, Dad." He leaned forward. "Titles mean nothing at 35,000 feet. Up there, respect keeps you safe, not power." There was a softness in his eyes that always steadied her. That was her father, a man who carried dignity like gravity, grounding everyone around him. From the kitchen, her mother's voice chimed in through the call. "Dr. Maya Carter, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Don't forget to eat, sweetheart. Respect starts with not fainting on stage." Naomi smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Maya looked at Elijah. "She gets your stubbornness, and your calm," he replied. "That's what'll save her someday." The call ended with a short silence, that lingering kind of love that didn't need words. Naomi exhaled, looking at her first-class ticket, row 2A, window seat. She'd saved the boarding pass like a trophy since her father booked it, not because it was first class, but because it was the first time she'd be flying alone, across an ocean, to speak for something bigger than herself. She walked through the terminal. People stared at a young black girl in a navy blazer, pulling a carry-on embossed with gold initials NC. Some smiled, others didn't. She was used to both. Her mother had told her, "You don't need everyone's approval to belong. You belong because you exist. As she reached the counter, the check-in agent, a tired woman in her 40s, glanced at Naomi's ticket and raised an eyebrow. First class. Naomi nodded politely. Yes, ma'am. The woman hesitated just long enough for the smile to feel heavy. Then she said, "Congratulations," and handed the boarding pass back. Naomi thanked her anyway. Respect first, always. Inside the boarding area, a travel vlogger, Luna Torres, camera in hand, was narrating her pre-flight routine for her followers. She caught Naomi in the frame by accident. "Look at this girl, future senator or something?" Luna laughed kindly. Naomi waved shyly, not knowing that small moment would one day go viral around the world. When they finally called first-class boarding, Naomi felt her heart flutter. She walked down the jet bridge, cool air, hum of engines, scent of jet fuel and leather. A flight attendant with auburn hair smiled at her. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter. You're in 2A, right up front." Naomi's seat was next to the window, the view framed by the rising Chicago dawn. She ran her hand across the seat controls, the smooth leather armrest. She whispered to herself, "This is really happening." The cabin filled slowly business travelers, couples, an older man in a tweed suit reading the Wall Street Journal. Everyone seemed to belong there, effortlessly. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt and smiled to herself. She didn't need to blend in. She just needed to be present. From the cockpit, muffled voices carried through the open door. A deep, authoritative tone said, "We've got a teenager in first class. Must be someone's mistake." The voice belonged to Captain Richard Hale, a man with 30 years of flight hours and even more years of unspoken prejudice. His co-pilot, Ethan Lee, younger and composed, replied quietly. Her boarding pass checked out. "Captain," Hale grunted. "Still doesn't look right." He didn't mean young. He didn't mean new. Naomi wouldn't hear the words clearly, but she would feel them soon enough. Back in her seat, she pulled out her debate notes, The Power of Empathy in Divided Societies. Her voice rehearsed softly. "Change doesn't start with anger. It starts with understanding." She smiled. Her topic felt right, like a prayer disguised as a speech. An elderly gentleman sitting across the aisle glanced at her. Mr. Howard Davis, retired civil rights lawyer. "You're the youngest in here," he said with a grin. Naomi chuckled. "Probably the quietest, too." He laughed. "Don't count on it. Quiet ones usually have the loudest truths." They exchanged a warm nod. For a moment, she felt like she belonged. The intercom crackled. "Good morning. This is Captain Hale. Welcome aboard Aurelia Air Flight 907 service to London Heathrow. Flight time today will be 7 hours and 40 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Naomi leaned against the window, watching the plane taxi onto the runway. She thought of her father, the man who built this airline from the ground up, who'd once flown through combat zones to save strangers. He never told her about prejudice directly, but his silences had always said enough. When the engines roared and the plane lifted off the ground, Naomi smiled, whispering under her breath, "See you soon, London." Outside, clouds rolled like soft waves. Inside, everything seemed still, safe, full of possibility. But beneath that calm sky, fate was quietly adjusting its altitude. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and new leather. Naomi Carter adjusted the belt around her waist as the plane climbed into the pale Chicago morning. For the first time in her life, she sat in first-class, legs stretched, heart steady. Outside, The sunlight painted the clouds gold. Inside, her notebook lay open to the first line of her speech. Empathy is the bridge between fear and understanding. The line comforted her. It reminded her of her father's steady voice, the one that never rose even in anger. She could almost hear him say, "Grace is power. Naomi, not weakness." She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the engines soothe her nerves. It was more than just a flight. It was proof that a girl like her, black, young, and bold, had every right to be seen, to sit, to exist wherever she chose. When she opened her eyes, the aisle shimmered under the overhead lights. A tall man in uniform stood there, silver captain bars on his shoulders, Captain Richard Hale. His face carried the tired sharpness of someone who had seen too much sky and learned too little from it. He stopped near her seat and frowned, as though something about the sight of her didn't fit the picture he carried in his head. "Miss," he began, his tone crisp, "are you sure you're in the right section?" Naomi blinked. "Excuse me." "Your seat." He gestured toward the cabin behind her. "This is first class." "I know," she said softly, but firmly. "That's what's on my ticket." The passengers nearby shifted in their seats. Some glanced up, then back down, the way people do when they sense discomfort but don't want to be part of it. Hale extended his hand. "May I see it?" Naomi reached into her bag and offered the neatly folded boarding pass. He studied it, his lips tightening as if the paper itself challenged him. He turned it over twice, checked the seat number, then the name, then the barcode. Finally, with a small snort, he tore it in half. The sound was small, a quick rip, but it echoed like thunder in Naomi's chest. "There," he said, holding the torn halves. "Looks like a system error. You'll need to move back until we sort this out." Naomi stared at the fluttering pieces of paper in his hand. Her first-class ticket, a gift from her father, reduced to confetti. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. "Sir, that's my seat. I belong here." He smiled without warmth. "I'm sure you think so." Something in the way he said "you" carried the weight of every time she'd ever been doubted, dismissed, or told to wait her turn. Before she could respond, a calm voice interrupted. Grace Miller, the head flight attendant, appeared at the aisle. Her uniform was immaculate, her smile practiced but sincere. "Captain, is there a problem?" Hale handed her the shredded ticket. Passenger was seated in the wrong section. Might have been an agent mistake. Grace examined the pieces, her brow creasing. Her name, Naomi Carter. Grace looked at Naomi, then back at the captain. "Miss Carter's name sounds familiar." "Familiar or not," Hale said, "she'll have to move until we verify." A few passengers murmured. One of them, Mr. Howard Davis, the elderly lawyer from across the aisle, set down his newspaper. "Captain, she's a young lady traveling alone. You might want to handle that with a touch more courtesy." Hale turned to him, jaw tight. "Sir, I'll handle my cabin as I see fit." Naomi felt her pulse race, but she drew in a slow breath. Her mother's voice whispered from memory, "Never meet arrogance with anger. Meet it with clarity." "Captain," she said, "steady now. I checked in properly. My father booked this seat." "Oh," his tone dripped with disbelief. "And your father would be—" She hesitated. She didn't want to say it, not because she was ashamed, but because she'd been raised to earn her respect, not inherit it. Grace stepped closer. "Captain, let me recheck the manifest." He waved her off. "I know how these mistakes happen. Sometimes staff upgrades passengers to fill space. Naomi's jaw clenched. You mean passengers like me? The captain gave a thin smile. I mean, passengers who shouldn't be here. That was it. The line that froze the air. Mr. Davis stood now, his cane steady in his hand. Captain Hale, I spent 40 years arguing civil rights cases. I suggest you tread carefully. Grace's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded her digital tablet. Her eyes scanned the crew list, then widened when she reached Naomi's record, VIP code EC01. Her throat went dry. She knew that code. It was reserved for the family of Elijah Carter, the CEO of Aurelia Air. She looked up, heart pounding. Captain, she said quietly, we need to talk, privately. But Hale brushed her off. If there's a problem, we'll handle it after takeoff. Naomi's composure cracked just enough for a single tear to escape. She wiped it quickly, refusing to give him the satisfaction. She whispered, You tore my ticket, not my dignity. Grace heard it. Her heart squeezed at the calm strength in the girl's voice. Hale, unbothered, turned to walk back to the cockpit. But as he did, Luna Torres, the travel vlogger seated in 3C, angled her phone slightly, recording. She'd caught the exchange from the moment he raised his voice. In the background, Naomi sat still, eyes fixed out the window. The sky stretched endlessly, indifferent to human cruelty. Grace knelt beside Naomi's seat. Miss Carter, I'm going to make this right. Naomi shook her head gently. It's not about me, ma'am. It's about how easy it was for him to assume I didn't belong. The words hung there, heavier than the hum of the engines. When Grace returned to the galley, she whispered to Ethan Lee, the first officer. Ethan. She's EC01. Ethan's eyes widened. You mean Grace nodded. Yes, the CEO's daughter. They exchanged a look of disbelief. Ethan exhaled. Then we have a much bigger problem. Back in the cockpit, Hale adjusted his headset, unaware that his fate was already descending upon him. Minutes later, Grace received a message from Ground Operations Confirmation Passenger Naomi Carter. Immediate alert to HQ. CEO notified. She swallowed hard. He's going to call. Ethan glanced toward the cockpit door. Then let's hope Hale answers it with both humility and luck. In first class, Naomi had closed her notebook. The pages fluttered against the air vent like restless thoughts. She stared at the blank space where her ticket had been. Mr. Davis leaned over. You handled that with grace, young lady. Naomi offered a small, weary smile. Grace doesn't always stop people from tearing things. Maybe not, he said, but it keeps you from tearing yourself. She nodded, grateful. The seatbelt sign chimed softly. The plane leveled at cruising altitude. Grace returned, placing a glass of water on Naomi's tray. Compliments of the crew, she said, her voice low, and the captain will not bother you again. Naomi looked at her, seeing the unspoken apology in her eyes. Thank you. Grace hesitated. He'll face this. I promise you. Outside, the world was made of clouds and light, beautiful but detached. Inside, tension rippled like static between rows of silence. Naomi leaned her head against the window, trying to focus on the horizon. In her mind, she replayed the moment Hale tore the ticket. The sound, the look, the smirk. It wasn't new, not really. She'd seen that look in classrooms, in stores, in quiet acts that said, you don't belong here. But she'd never imagined it would follow her 35,000 feet into the air. She closed her eyes, Her father's voice came back. "Up there. Respect keeps you safe," she whispered to herself. "Then I guess I'll have to carry enough respect for both of us." The intercom crackled again, startling her. Grace's voice now, not Hale's. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're expecting a short communication from ground control." Ground control. That meant something was happening. Naomi didn't know yet that, in a quiet office thousands of miles away, her father's phone was already lighting up with an emergency code. She didn't know the sky she was flying through was about to become the stage for something far bigger than humiliation. And she didn't know that the man who'd torn her ticket would soon find his own authority ripped apart, piece by piece. But she did know one thing: no matter what happened next, she wouldn't look away. She sat up straight, steady, unbroken. The engines roared softly beneath her feet, carrying her higher into the storm she didn't see coming. The moment the captain disappeared into the cockpit, silence pressed against the walls of first class. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows a slap, stunned, vibrating, heavy with shame that doesn't belong to you but somehow sticks anyway. Naomi Carter sat frozen, her pulse echoing in her ears. The torn halves of her ticket still rested in her lap like evidence of something cruel and absurd. She could feel every stare, some sympathetic, some judgmental, some curious in that detached way people watch a car crash. Her throat ached, but no tears came. She refused to cry. Not here, not in front of him, not in front of strangers who would mistake her tears for weakness. Grace Miller appeared beside her again, this time kneeling, her voice a low whisper meant only for Naomi. "Miss Carter, I'm truly sorry for what happened. That was out of line, completely unprofessional. I will take care of this." Naomi looked at her, searching for sincerity, and found it. Grace's face carried that rare kind of honesty you couldn't fake. Naomi nodded. "Thank you. But he shouldn't have." She trailed off, her voice cracking once before she caught it. "He shouldn't have done that to anyone." Grace placed a hand over Naomi's, light but firm. "You're right. He shouldn't have." She rose, took a deep breath, and turned toward the galley. Her jaw was tight now, her professionalism fighting with the anger behind her ribs. In the third row, Mr. Howard Davis folded his newspaper and shook his head. "I've seen this movie before," he muttered to himself. The younger flight attendant passing by looked at him, puzzled. "Sir," he smiled sadly. "History doesn't repeat, it just changes uniforms." Luna Torres, the travel vlogger, had set her phone on her tray, recording discreetly. She didn't plan to post anything yet, but she felt it the weight of something bigger than a travel story happening right in front of her lens, inside the galley. Grace found Ethan Lee reviewing flight data on his tablet. She closed the curtain and spoke in a hushed tone. "Ethan, we have a situation." He glanced up, I'm aware. The captain's voice carried halfway down the aisle. Grace exhaled sharply. She's not just any passenger. Her file has a VIP code, EC01. Ethan frowned. "That's her father." "Yes, Elijah Carter." Ethan's eyes widened. "The Elijah Carter. The one who built this airline from scratch." Grace nodded, "and his daughter just got humiliated by our captain before takeoff." Ethan leaned back, stunned. "That's a career-ending mistake." Grace crossed her arms. "More than a mistake. It's a disgrace." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Then Ethan sighed. "We need to notify HQ immediately. But this isn't about hierarchy. It's about right and wrong. Grace nodded. Still, he deserves to know what happened to his child. Back in the cabin. Naomi had pulled out her notebook again. Though her eyes barely focused on the words, the ink swam across the page. She thought of her father's voice the night before, steady, certain, kind. He'd said, "Respect yourself first, princess," even when they forget how to. She hadn't realized how hard that could be until now. Mr. Davis leaned over slightly, his voice gentle. "You handled yourself with grace, young lady. Don't let one man make you question who you are." Naomi smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir. But it's not just about me. It's about how easy it is for people like him to think they can do that." He nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part. You can't teach conscience. It has to be chosen." She turned to the window, letting the clouds blur into soft shapes. The reflection of her face in the glass looked older somehow, like she'd aged a few years in the last 20 minutes. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hale adjusted the autopilot, his jaw still tight. He didn't regret tearing the ticket, not yet. In his mind, he was maintaining order. "First class isn't a free-for-all," he muttered. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at the clouds ahead, lips pressed thin. After a moment, Ethan spoke quietly. "Captain, I think we should clarify the passenger situation. There might have been a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," Hale said flatly. "I know when someone doesn't belong." Ethan turned his head, his calm voice sharpening. "With respect, sir, belonging isn't your call to make." The captain shot him a glare, but Ethan didn't flinch. "Just flying the plane, sir?" he added, eyes back on the instruments. Hale grumbled something under his breath and leaned back, but unease crept in. He couldn't quite name it, something in Ethan's tone, or the way the crew had gone unusually quiet. Meanwhile, Grace had already sent the coded message to ground operations incident on Flight 907 involving VIP passenger, immediate escalation. The response came within minutes. Confirmed, CEO informed, await directive. She read the words twice. Her stomach tightened. When she stepped back into first class, she saw Naomi still gazing out the window. Grace approached softly. "Miss Carter, may I offer you something to drink?" Naomi shook her head. "No, thank you." Then, after a pause, "Actually, water would be nice." Grace poured it carefully, her hands steadier now. "Your father built this airline with honor. Don't let one man's ignorance taint what it stands for." Naomi met her eyes. "You knew." Grace hesitated. "Not at first, but now I do." Naomi exhaled slowly. "Then please don't treat me differently. Just make sure no one else goes through this." Grace nodded, her voice soft. "I will." At that same moment, thousands of miles away, Elijah Carter sat in his New York boardroom reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant rushed in, pale-faced. "Sir, urgent message from operations. It concerns your daughter." He took the tablet, scanned the alert, and froze. For the first time in his long career, he felt his pulse spike. The message was brief but devastatingly clear. Passenger Naomi Carter harassment by Captain Hale incident recorded by passengers. His hand clenched the tablet so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Around him, the executives at the table stopped breathing. He stood, his voice calm but cold. "Cancel the rest of the meeting. Get me a secure line to Flight 907. Now. Back in the air." Grace's headset crackled. "This is Aurelia HQ. Patch incoming call from CEO Carter." Her breath caught. She turned to Ethan, who immediately understood. "I'll route it through the cockpit," he said. Seconds later, the intercom light blinked red. Hale looked up, frowning. "What's this?" Ethan replied evenly. "HQ on the line. Direct communication request from Mr. Carter." The captain hesitated, then reached for the headset. "Control, this is Captain Hale." The voice that came through was measured, deep, unmistakable. "Captain Hale, this is Elijah Carter." The color drained from the captain's face. "Mr. Carter, sir." "I don't speak." Elijah interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that filled the cabin even through the metal and wires. "You've made an error that goes beyond protocol, sir." There was confusion about. There was no confusion, Elijah said sharply. "There was prejudice, and you aimed it at my daughter." Hale froze. His tongue stumbled over apologies that sounded hollow even to him. "I had no idea." "Exactly," Elijah said. "You never thought to ask. You saw her face, her skin, and decided she didn't belong. That tells me all I need to know about who you are." The line went silent except for the hum of the engines. Ethan sat stiffly, avoiding Hale's gaze. Elijah's voice returned, quieter but colder. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. First Officer Lee will assume command for the remainder of the flight. You're not to enter that cockpit again." Hale's mouth opened, but no sound came. The air in the cabin seemed to thin. Grace, listening from the galley, closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "It's done. In first class." Naomi hadn't heard the exact words yet, but she felt the shift in the air. The flight attendants moved differently, now deliberate, careful, protective. Grace appeared once more, her expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "your father is aware of what happened." Naomi's breath caught. "He knows, yes, and he's handling it." Naomi stared down at her hands, unsure if she felt relief or guilt. She didn't want this to become a spectacle. She only wanted fairness. Grace sensed her unease. Sometimes justice makes noise before it brings peace. Naomi looked up, her eyes shimmering but steady. Then, "I hope it's worth the noise." When the cabin lights dimmed for meal service, no one felt hungry. Passengers whispered, exchanging glances. The story had spread in murmurs. The girl in 2A is the CEO's daughter. The captain's in trouble. In the crew rest area. Hale sat alone, head in his hands. His world had shifted in one transmission. For the first time in decades, the man who thought he ruled the sky realized he was falling. Naomi didn't look back again. She turned her gaze toward the horizon. The clouds stretched endlessly, soft and golden, somewhere up there. Justice was finding its wings. The cabin lights dimmed, leaving only the soft blue glow along the aisle. Passengers whispered, pretending to read or sleep, but every ear strained for scraps of information. They all felt it, the tremor of something bigger than turbulence. Grace Miller stood near the galley, fingers clenched around her radio headset, listening as operations confirmed what she already knew: Elijah Carter was on the line, and the entire chain of command was now watching Flight 907. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard Hale sat motionless, staring at the instrument panel as if he could will it to stay the same. He could feel Ethan Lee's quiet presence beside him, controlled and unshakable. The young first officer had been the one to open the channel that connected them to ground control. Hale had protested at first, but the decision had already been made above him. He was no longer in charge. though he refused to accept it. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Captain, HQ is requesting direct communication again." Hale exhaled through his nose, slow and irritated. "They've already said enough? This isn't a request we can ignore." Ethan replied evenly, "Sir, it's Mr. Carter himself." The name fell heavy between them. Hale's fingers tightened on the yoke. For years he had flown under Aurelia's banner, proud of his record, proud of the wings pinned above his heart. But now, even the embroidered logo on his sleeve seemed to burn. "Patch it through," he muttered. The headset crackled. Then came a voice so calm it cut sharper than any shout. "Captain Hale." He swallowed. "Mr. Carter, I've just spoken with operations," Elijah said. "I understand you had an incident with one of my passengers." "Sir," I assure you Elijah's tone didn't rise, but it carried a command that silenced every excuse. "You tore up a first-class ticket belonging to a 17-year-old girl, without verification, without cause. Is that accurate?" Hale hesitated. There was confusion at boarding. She didn't appear to. Didn't appear to what? "Captain." The question was soft but deadly precise. To belong, no answer came, only the low hum of the engines. Elijah continued, voice steady, as if he were delivering a lesson rather than an accusation. "You've flown long enough to know this airline was built on one principal dignity. I founded Aurelia Air after watching too many people treated as invisible in the skies. I wanted to prove we could fly better, not just higher. Tell me, Captain, what part of that mission did you forget?" Hale's mouth went dry. He opened it, then closed it again. Words felt useless now. Ethan sat perfectly still, his hands folded, his respect for his superior replaced by something closer to pity. Elijah didn't wait for an answer. Effective immediately. "You are relieved of command. Mr. Lee will take control of Flight 907 for the remainder of the journey." Hale's head snapped toward Ethan. "You can't do that from the ground." "I can," Elijah said, "and I just did. You may have logged 30 years of flight hours, Captain, but respect isn't cumulative. It must be renewed every day." The line went quiet. Hale felt his pulse hammer in his ears. For the first time in his career, the cockpit felt too small, too heavy, too full of ghosts whispering all the moments he could have chosen better. Ethan reached for the controls, his voice calm. "Sir, I'll handle communication with air traffic control from here." Hale stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. "I never meant harm," he said, almost to himself. "I believe that," Ethan replied, "but intent doesn't erase impact." When Grace entered the cockpit moments later, she found Hale slumped in his chair. She handed Ethan a printed directive from HQ confirming the command change. Ethan signed it quietly and began reviewing descent parameters. Grace didn't say a word. She placed a glass of water on the small shelf beside Hale and turned to leave. Her small act of decency stung more than her silence. In the cabin, Naomi Carter sat rigid in her seat, unaware of the full extent of what had just unfolded. All she knew was that the air felt different, now lighter somehow, as if something had shifted in her favor for the first time that day. Grace appeared beside her again, eyes softer this time. "Miss Carter," she said gently, "your father spoke with the crew. Everything has been handled." Naomi blinked. "Handled?" Grace nodded. "Captain Hale will not be piloting this flight any longer." The words settled over Naomi slowly. Her first reaction wasn't satisfaction, it was disbelief. He's removed. Yes, your father made that call himself. Naomi stared down at her hands. She didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to cheer. Another part wanted to cry. Mostly, she just wanted the world to stop making her prove her worth. She finally whispered, "I didn't want anyone fired. I just wanted him to see me." Grace knelt, her voice low. Sometimes people can't see until they're forced to look. What your father did, he didn't do it for revenge. He did it to make sure no one else goes through this. Naomi nodded slowly. He always does that. As the flight continued, the story began to ripple through the cabin. A businessman leaned toward his seatmate, murmuring, "The captain's out." "Can you believe it?" a young couple whispered. "That girl's the CEO's daughter." Someone else muttered, "Good for her." Meanwhile, at Aurelia's headquarters in Chicago, Elijah Carter's staff watched the live telemetry of Flight 907. The boardroom was silent except for the steady beep of data feeds. Elijah stood by the window overlooking the city, hands clasped behind his back. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, calm, collected. But beneath that stillness burned something old and raw. He'd seen this kind of injustice before. He'd lived it, long before he ever wore a suit or held a title. His assistant, a young woman named Clara, approached carefully. "Sir, the press might pick up chatter from passengers. Do you want to prepare a statement?" Elijah shook his head. "Not yet. Let the truth arrive before the headlines do." On board. Ethan monitored the instruments, his professionalism masking the tension in the air. He adjusted course toward the Atlantic corridor, then turned to Hale. "Sir, procedures require that you remain in the jump seat until landing." Hale nodded wordlessly. His hands trembled slightly, but he clasped them together to hide it. For the first time, he looked like an old man rather than a captain. Through the cockpit glass, the horizon stretched endless and blue. He thought of the thousands of flights he'd commanded, the lives he'd carried, the pride he once felt when passengers clapped after smooth landings. When had that pride turned into arrogance? When had confidence curdled into contempt? He whispered, so quietly that Ethan barely caught it, "Maybe I stopped looking at faces." Ethan said nothing. Some lessons had to echo in silence. Back in the cabin, Naomi reached for her phone. There were already messages waiting her mother, probably told by her father, her debate coach, wishing her luck, her best friend, sending memes and hearts. She wanted to reply, but her hands trembled. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only exhaustion and a strange ache behind her ribs. "Mr. Davis leaned over again, his voice warm. "You did well, young lady. You held your head high. That's harder than people think." Naomi smiled faintly. "I just kept hearing my dad in my head. Grace first, always." "That's a lesson worth keeping," he said. Luna Torres, still pretending to scroll on her phone, glanced over at Naomi. She wanted to say something, an apology maybe, for recording, but decided against it. The truth mattered, and this truth needed to be seen. Outside, the light shifted as the plane crossed the ocean. The sun glimmered on the water far below like scattered gold coins. Grace moved quietly through the cabin, her steps measured, her posture strong. Every gesture she made now carried meaning, a refill, a nod, a smile. It was her silent rebellion against everything she'd just witnessed. Hours later, Elijah called again, this time speaking directly with Ethan. His voice carried through the headset. Softer now. Mr. Lee, thank you for maintaining composure. I'll see to it personally that your professionalism is recognized. Ethan replied, Just doing my job. Sir, you did more than that, Elijah said. Then, after a pause, Please tell my daughter she's safe. Ethan turned to Grace, who nodded and walked back down the aisle. When she reached Naomi, she crouched beside her again. Your father asked me to tell you he's proud of you. Naomi bit her lip. He said that Grace smiled, word for word. For the first time since takeoff, Naomi felt warmth bloom in her chest. The humiliation still lingered, but something else rose with it, a quiet pride that didn't need applause. As night fell outside, stars began to dot the sky. Naomi leaned her head against the window and watched the reflection of her own face merge with the constellations. Somewhere out there, thousands of feet below, people were living their ordinary lives, unaware that on this flight, one girl had just learned how to carry herself through injustice without losing her grace. And somewhere in the cockpit, a man who once believed he owned the sky was finally realizing how small he was beneath it. The steady hum of the engines filled the air like background music to an unfolding reckoning. Captain Richard Hale sat stiff in the jump seat at the back of the cockpit, eyes hollow, his hands pressed tightly together as though he could hold on to the last fragments of control. The embroidered wings on his uniform seemed heavier now, more like a reminder than a badge. Beside him, First Officer Ethan Lee managed the aircraft systems, his posture calm and assured. The silence between them was thick but not hostile. It was the silence of consequence. Outside the cockpit, Grace Miller stood by the door, listening for a moment before speaking through her intercom to headquarters. Aurelia Air confirms command has been officially transferred to First Officer Ethan Lee, she said in her professional cadence. Then, quietly, she added, Passenger safety is stable. When she hung up, her hand lingered on the receiver as if it could absorb the weight of what had just occurred. The aircraft glided through the upper atmosphere, the cabin lights dimmed to twilight hues. Naomi Carter sat in her seat, still wide awake. The water glass Grace had given her hours earlier was half empty. The ice long melted. She stared at the condensation sliding down the glass, each droplet falling in rhythm with her heartbeat. She felt both vindicated and unsettled, as if victory had come wrapped in something sharp. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles. Some whispered to one another in disbelief. Others pretended nothing had happened. But everyone knew that something irreversible had shifted that day. An invisible wall inside the company had cracked. In the cockpit, Hale leaned forward suddenly. You've got control, he muttered, his voice strained. Ethan nodded, eyes on the altimeter. I have control. Hale's voice was low, but it trembled with anger. 30 years in this seat, 30 years without a single violation, and now this. Ethan didn't respond right away. He adjusted a dial before saying softly, Sometimes one moment tells the truth about all the others. Hale turned his gaze toward the sky beyond the windshield. You think I'm a bad man? Ethan's tone remained gentle. I think you forgot what it meant to be a good one. That silence hurt more than any reprimand. Hale looked down at his hands, the same hands that had guided aircraft through storms, mechanical failures, and emergency landings. He had saved lives, earned medals, yet now those same hands had ripped apart a teenage girl's dignity as if it were paper. He whispered, I didn't see it happening until it was done. Ethan nodded. That's how prejudice works, Captain. It hides inside pride. In the cabin. Grace paused beside Naomi. Would you like to move to a quieter area? She asked softly. Naomi shook her head. No, I'll stay here. Grace smiled faintly. You remind me of someone I used to be. Naomi tilted her head. What happened to her? Grace's eyes softened. She grew up and realized the world doesn't always clap for what's right, but she did it anyway. Naomi returned the smile. Then, maybe I'll grow up like her. For a while, neither spoke. The plane moved through pockets of air that made the cabin sway slightly. Naomi rested her hand on the armrest, fingers tapping to the rhythm of the engines. Grace looked down the aisle, her expression thoughtful. Passengers were beginning to stir. Some approached quietly to offer Naomi encouraging words. A woman whispered, "You were brave, sweetheart." Another nodded respectfully from across the aisle. A few took out their phones. Scrolling through the news feeds already buzzing with speculation, someone had leaked that there was an incident involving the CEO's daughter aboard Aurelia Air Flight 907. Luna Torres, the travel blogger, was staring at her phone in disbelief. Her short clip of the confrontation had been uploaded hours ago without much thought. But now, notifications flooded her screen. Comments poured in. This is outrageous. Fire that pilot. That girl's face broke my heart. The video was spreading faster than she could process. She hesitated before posting another clip the moment Grace told Naomi, "You belong here." She typed a caption, "When dignity flies higher than any aircraft," then hit upload. By the time the Atlantic shimmered beneath the plane, millions had seen Naomi's calm face and the captain's dismissive glare. Hashtags formed, headlines hinted, and discussions ignited. But Naomi didn't know that yet. She sat quietly, unaware that her composure had already become a symbol. Inside the cockpit, Hale finally spoke again. "Do you think he'll let me fly again?" Ethan hesitated. "That depends on whether you understand what you did." "I tore a ticket," Hale said bitterly. "That's all." Ethan turned to him, his voice firm. "No, Captain, you tore a piece of someone's faith and fairness. That's harder to repair than paper." For a moment, Hale's mask cracked. His eyes glistened, not with defiance but confusion, like a man realizing too late that the ground he stood on was eroding. He leaned back, exhausted. "When I joined this airline, Elijah Carter was just a name on a memo. I didn't know him." Ethan adjusted the controls. "You didn't need to know him. You just needed to remember who you were supposed to be." Grace entered the cockpit quietly, carrying a sealed envelope from the onboard printer official communication from HQ. She handed it to Ethan, who unfolded it and read aloud. "Captain Hale is to be grounded upon arrival, pending internal review. Flight crew to ensure safety and discretion of passenger Naomi Carter." Grace took a deep breath. "I'll see to the cabin." She glanced at Hale before leaving. "For what it's worth, Captain, I hope you use this time to remember why you ever wanted to fly." When the door closed behind her, Hale whispered, "Because the sky didn't judge me," Ethan said softly. "Maybe it never did, but the people under it do." Hours passed. The aircraft glided steadily over the ocean. Naomi dozed for a while, her dreams restless. She saw her father standing at the end of a runway, sunlight behind him, saying nothing, only looking at her with that familiar quiet pride. When she woke, the cabin was dim and peaceful. Grace sat across the aisle, sipping coffee, her posture watchful. Naomi stretched slightly. "What time is it? About 3 hours until London," Grace said. Naomi rubbed her eyes. "Feels longer." Grace chuckled softly. "Long flights do that, especially when they carry heavy lessons." Naomi nodded. "Do you think my dad's angry?" Grace thought for a moment. Not angry. Just hurt that someone would treat his daughter the way people once treated him. Naomi looked down. "He's been through it too, hasn't he?" Grace smiled sadly. "Every great man has scars he doesn't show." In the cockpit, Ethan received a final message from HQ confirming the approach schedule. Hale remained silent, staring at the streaks of dawn beginning to color the horizon. He thought about Naomi, the girl who had sat so still while he stripped away her dignity. He remembered her words. "You tore my ticket, not my dignity." They replayed in his head like a heartbeat. For the first time in years, Hale felt something close to humility. It didn't come easy. It burned, slow and deep, reshaping him in ways he couldn't articulate. He turned toward Ethan. "When we land, tell her." He stopped himself. "Never mind. She wouldn't want to hear from me." Ethan looked at him, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe not now, but one day she might need to know you saw her." The older man nodded faintly. "Then tell her I finally did." Outside, the light over the Atlantic brightened, spilling gold over the wings of the plane. It was the first real dawn Hale had noticed in a long time. Back in first class, Naomi pressed her forehead against the window, watching the sky change colors. She whispered to herself, "The world looks softer from up here." Grace, overhearing, smiled. "Maybe because you're above the storm." Naomi turned to her. "For now." Grace nodded. "For now." Somewhere between the clouds and the ocean, between guilt and grace, the line between power and humanity blurred. One man's authority had been stripped away, but in its place, another kind of power took flight, the quiet strength of dignity reclaimed. The plane sailed steadily through the last stretch of night, engines purring like a heartbeat that refused to sleep. The tension had thinned but hadn't disappeared. It hung faintly in the recycled air, like the ghost of thunder after a storm. Naomi Carter sat quietly by her window, her reflection layered over the faint light of dawn rising somewhere beyond the horizon. She didn't know if she felt lighter or heavier. All she knew was that she didn't feel the same. Grace Miller approached softly, her steps almost silent on the carpeted floor. She carried a glass of orange juice this time, condensation glistening on its surface. "Something a bit sweeter than water," she said, placing it on Naomi's tray. Naomi smiled gently. "Thank you." Grace studied her face for a moment, the quiet restraint, the maturity far beyond 17. "You remind me of my daughter," she said. "She's 16, always asking the world to be fair." Naomi looked down at the drink. "Does it listen?" Grace gave a soft, tired laugh. "Sometimes, when people like you speak." For a while, they sat in silence, the kind that doesn't feel empty. It was the first real peace the flight had felt in hours. At the back of the cabin, Richard Hale remained seated alone. His uniform jacket was folded neatly beside him, as though he could still keep some dignity and order. His eyes were unfocused, tracing invisible patterns on the wall in front of him. Every sound around him felt sharper now, the click of a buckle, the whisper of passengers, the low hum of engines. They were sounds he'd heard his entire life, yet for the first time they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's world. He glanced toward the cockpit door where Ethan Lee was now fully in command. He could see the reflection of the younger man's calm posture against the glass. Ethan spoke softly into his headset, his tone composed, his focus unbroken. Hale felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: respect, tinged with regret. He had spent decades believing authority was earned through seniority, through years logged and storms survived. But now, sitting stripped of his title, he realized authority without humility was just ego in uniform. In his mind, he replayed Elijah Carter's voice over the radio comm, decisive, carrying the kind of power that didn't need volume to be heard. That voice had cut deeper than anger ever could, at headquarters in Chicago. Elijah stood before a large window overlooking the sleeping city. His assistant, Clara, had just briefed him on the video spreading across social media. Millions of views, tens of thousands of comments, people from every corner of the country weighing in, sharing stories of similar humiliation, similar disbelief. He hadn't expected the world to react this quickly, but he wasn't surprised either. Injustice had a way of catching fire when it was recorded. "Do we issue a statement?" Clara asked quietly. Elijah shook his head. "Not yet. The plane hasn't landed." He looked out at the skyline, his reflection merging with the dawn. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said, more to himself than to anyone. "It's about every person who's ever been told they didn't belong in a seat they paid for." Back in the sky, Naomi's eyelids fluttered shut for a moment. She wasn't sleeping, just resting. Her mind drifted to her father, his voice steady and his lessons gentle but firm. She remembered being 8 years old, sitting in a hangar watching him inspect a small training jet. He'd handed her a tiny model plane and said, "Flying isn't about altitude, it's about attitude." She hadn't understood then. Now, at 35,000 feet, she finally did. Grace returned to the galley, where 2 other attendants were whispering nervously. "Is it true?" the captain's fired one asked. Grace sighed. "He's grounded. For now. The investigation will decide the rest." The younger attendant frowned. "He was always strict, but I never thought that's the problem." Grace interrupted gently. "No one ever thinks it'll happen until it does." Ethan called her on the intercom. "Grace, can you step into the cockpit for a moment?" She entered quietly. Hale didn't look up. Ethan handed her a note from HQ. "They want a statement from you as witness." Grace read it, nodded, understood. Ethan glanced at Hale, then back to her. "Make it honest. The company needs truth, not protection." Grace met his gaze. "That's the only thing I know how to give." When she left, Hale muttered under his breath, "So now I'm the villain." Ethan didn't turn around. "No. Captain, you just stop being the hero." Hale's breath caught in his throat. He looked down, realizing that somewhere along the way, he'd mistaken respect for authority and kindness for weakness. He wondered when his eyes had grown so used to looking down on others that they forgot how to look inward. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded photo him and his first crew, 25 years ago. Back then, he'd been the youngest on the team, full of ambition and awe. He'd promised himself he'd never forget what it felt like to earn those wings. Somewhere between promotions and years, he had broken that promise. A quiet sob escaped him, not loud, not dramatic, but small, human, and raw. Ethan pretended not to hear. Hours slipped by in a hush. The cabin lights brightened slightly, Signaling breakfast service, Grace returned with trays, her movements gentle. She stopped by Naomi again, offering a meal she barely touched. Naomi looked up at her. "Is he still up there?" Grace nodded. "He's staying in the cockpit until landing." Naomi hesitated. "Does he regret it?" Grace thought for a moment. "He's beginning to." Naomi looked down at her food. "Good. Regret's a start." The plane began its descent, the engines humming lower. Through the window, London was coming into view, bathed in early morning light. Naomi's heart lifted at the sight of it, the city she'd dreamed of, now tied forever to something she'd never forget. As the wheels touched down on the runway, a wave of applause rippled softly through the cabin. It wasn't for the landing itself, but for the strange, unspoken relief of surviving a long night of tension and truth. When the aircraft rolled to a stop, Ethan's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow. On behalf of Aurelia Air, we thank you for flying with us." His tone was calm, deliberate, and quietly dignified. Grace moved down the aisle, directing passengers to disembark. When she reached Naomi, she paused. "He'll have to leave last," she said, referring to Hale. Naomi nodded. "I understand." As the cabin emptied, Hale remained in the cockpit, eyes fixed ahead. He didn't move until Ethan stood and unbuckled his harness. "It's time," Ethan said softly. Hale rose, every motion heavy with the weight of consequence. As he stepped out, he caught sight of Naomi standing near the exit. Their eyes met briefly. She didn't glare, didn't speak. She just looked at him with quiet steadiness, the kind of look that stripped a man's excuses bare. He gave a small nod, almost a bow, before walking past her. Outside, the airport buzzed with officials and reporters waiting for confirmation of what they already knew. Naomi stepped onto the jet bridge, breathing in the cool London air. For the first time since boarding, she felt free. Grace touched her arm lightly. "Your father's waiting at the terminal." Naomi smiled faintly. "Of course he is." As she walked down the long corridor toward customs, she caught a glimpse of herself reflected in the glass, no longer just a girl flying to a competition, but someone who had faced humiliation, stayed composed, and walked out stronger. Behind her, in the belly of the plane, Hale sat in silence as two ground officers approached. One of them offered to carry his bag. He refused, standing a little taller, as if dignity could be reclaimed through the smallest gesture. Grace watched from the window as Naomi disappeared into the crowd beyond the gate, the morning light outlining her silhouette. It was a picture Grace knew she would never forget, a girl who had weathered injustice without letting it define her. As the terminal doors closed behind Naomi, the first rays of sunrise broke through the clouds, casting gold light across the tarmac. For a fleeting moment, even the sky seemed to acknowledge what had changed. The morning light over London spilled through the wide glass panels of Heathrow's terminal like liquid gold. Naomi Carter stepped into it, dragging her small carry-on behind her. The soft hum of travelers, the echo of announcements, and the rhythmic roll of suitcase wheels filled the air, but she barely heard any of it. Every step felt heavier than the one before. The ordeal from the night before clung to her like invisible smoke. She could still feel the rip of the ticket in her memory, hear the murmured disbelief of the passengers, sense the sting of eyes judging her before they even knew her name. At the far end of the arrivals gate, a tall figure stood waiting Elijah Carter, calm as ever in a dark coat and scarf, his presence commanding without effort. When their eyes met, Naomi quickened her pace. For a moment, she was a little girl again, running to her father after scraping her knee. She reached him, and he opened his arms. The hug said what words couldn't. "You're safe. You're home." He held her for a few seconds longer than usual before pulling back to study her face. "You handled yourself well," he said softly. "Better than most adults I know." Naomi blinked hard, fighting tears. "I didn't feel brave, Dad. I just didn't want to give him what he wanted." Elijah nodded. "That's what courage really is, doing right when you feel small." They began walking toward the exit. A few bystanders turned their heads, whispers followed them, and Naomi could feel the weight of recognition starting to grow. She pulled her cap lower over her face, uncomfortable with the attention. Outside the glass, a cluster of reporters gathered near the VIP exit. Microphones and cameras flashed like lightning. Elijah's head of security gestured discreetly toward a side corridor. "Sir, this way, please." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't seem surprised. "It's begun," he murmured. By the time they reached the car, questions were already being shouted. "Carter, is it true you fired the pilot mid-flight? How is your daughter doing? Is Aurelia Air facing a discrimination scandal?" Elijah didn't answer. He placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, guiding her into the car. The door shut, muting the chaos outside. Inside, silence stretched for a long moment. Naomi turned to him. "Dad, are you in trouble because of me?" He looked out the window before replying. "No, sweetheart. Trouble happens when you stay silent. You spoke your truth." He met her gaze. "Now it's my turn. At Aurelia Air's London Operations Center." The news had already arrived before they did. Screens in the lobby showed headlines from every major outlet. Airline CEO fires captain mid-flight. Teen humiliated in first class. Justice at 35,000 feet. The story had gone global in less than 12 hours. Luna Torres's video, shaky but powerful, had become the centerpiece of every article. Millions watched as Captain Hale ripped Naomi's ticket, heard his words dripping with disbelief, saw her calm defiance. There were comments from politicians, celebrities, and activists. Some praised Aurelia Air's swift response, others accused the company of damage control. Everyone had an opinion. In the back seat of the car, Naomi scrolled through the feed on her phone. The numbers rising felt unreal. 4 million views, then 5. She clicked on one video where people analyzed her expression, calling her poised beyond her years. Another thread praised Elijah's zero-tolerance leadership. Yet, beneath the praise, she saw the comments that hurt ones doubting her, saying she must have used her father's power to humiliate the captain. Her stomach turned. "They think I wanted this attention," she said quietly. Elijah sighed. "People always confuse being seen with seeking fame. Ignore them. You did nothing wrong. I just wanted to fly to London. Dad, I know." He reached over, squeezed her hand. "But sometimes we don't choose the fights that define us. They find us anyway." Back at Aurelia's Chicago headquarters, a conference room full of executives stared at the screen as the PR team briefed them. Clara, Elijah's assistant, stood at the head of the table, crisp and focused. "We're trending on every major platform. Positive sentiment is at 65%, which is unusually high for an incident like this. But if we don't control the narrative by noon, it could shift." The head of communications leaned forward. "We should release a statement emphasizing immediate corrective action. reinforce the message of accountability. One of the older board members frowned. Or we could downplay it, let the news cycle move on. If we keep feeding it, it'll stay alive longer. Clara shot him a sharp look. Sir, with respect, the world is watching. Silence would look like guilt. When Elijah entered, the room went silent. He took his seat without ceremony and scanned the faces around him. We're not running from this, he said. We're confronting it. A junior PR manager hesitated. Sir, what should the tone of the message be? Defensive emotional, Elijah shook his head. Human. Tell the truth. A pilot acted out of bias. He's been terminated. My daughter was humiliated, but she handled herself with grace. We'll review every level of our company to make sure this never happens again. He paused, voice low but firm, and I'll say it myself, on camera. Gasps filled the room. Sir, that's not recommended. One executive protested. It could expose us to legal risk. Elijah's gaze swept the table. The greater risk is pretending nothing happened. Meanwhile, in a small hotel near the airport, Richard Hale sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his folded uniform. It lay there neatly, lifeless, stripped of meaning. His phone buzzed nonstop, calls from reporters, messages from colleagues, even old friends offering advice he couldn't bear to read. He had thought he would feel anger, but what he felt instead was emptiness. He turned on the television. His own face appeared on the screen beside Naomi's, a still image of the moment he tore the ticket. The caption read, Aurelia Captain grounded after racist incident. The sight made him physically flinch. He muted the TV and buried his head in his hands. For the first time, he whispered out loud, What have I done? The door knocked. He opened it to find a company representative, Arthur Cole, head of corporate security in Europe. Arthur's face was unreadable. Mr. Hale, I'm here to escort you to the local office. You'll be debriefed and then flown back to the States. Hale nodded silently, grabbed his uniform jacket, and followed. On the drive, Arthur spoke evenly. You've been with the company a long time. 32 years, Hale replied. Arthur nodded. Then you know this isn't just about policy, it's about trust. Hale turned to the window, voice brittle. I don't expect forgiveness. Arthur looked at him in the rearview mirror. Forgiveness isn't the point. Understanding is. Back in London, Elijah and Naomi sat side by side in the quiet of their hotel suite. The city stretched below them, rain tapping softly against the glass. Naomi scrolled again through her phone, but paused when she saw a comment pinned to Luna Torres's video. It was from a man named Captain Marcus Evans. It read, Thank you, Miss Carter. Because of you, pilots like me have a chance to be seen for more than what's on our skin. Naomi smiled faintly. Dad. Look. Elijah read the comment and exhaled slowly. That's the beginning of something better. Naomi looked up at him. You really think so? I know so. Change starts as a whisper before it becomes a movement. He stood, walked to the window, and gazed out at the gray horizon. Tomorrow, I'll hold a press conference, and then I'm coming home to rebuild the company from the inside out. Naomi joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. You always fix things. Not always, he said quietly, but I try. As the evening settled, the rain stopped, and London city lights began to shimmer in the wet streets below. Naomi's phone buzzed again, a notification from her debate team back home. They'd seen the news too. Win that trophy. The message read, Show them who you are. She smiled, this time without heaviness. For the first time since the flight, Naomi realized the story was no longer about humiliation. It was about resilience, about standing tall even when the world tried to shrink you. And, far away, in a dark hotel room, Richard Hale stared at his reflection in the mirror. He straightened his back, adjusted his collar, and whispered to himself, "Maybe it's time to learn how to see again." The next morning, London woke to the story plastered across every front page. Aurelia Airlines scandal. Teen humiliated by veteran pilot. Underneath the bold headline was Naomi Carter's photo. Her calm face, eyes steady, captured mid-flight by someone's shaky phone camera. It was strange seeing herself there, half smiling, half hurting, the symbol of something she hadn't meant to start. Elijah Carter sat at the small breakfast table near the window of their hotel suite, dressed sharply in a charcoal suit. The television hummed quietly with the news anchor's voice discussing the incident. Naomi lingered near the window, watching raindrops gather on the glass before sliding down in thin, glimmering trails. "You don't have to watch it," Elijah said, his tone gentle. Naomi shook her head. "It's everywhere. Dad, even if I turn it off, I'll still hear it." He folded his hands. "Then remember, you don't owe the world a performance. You just owe yourself peace." She turned toward him, her voice small but firm. "Are you still going to do the press conference?" "Yes," he replied. "Today at noon." Naomi hesitated. "Won't that make it worse?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Transparency never makes things worse. Only lies do." Downstairs, the hotel lobby was a hive of reporters. Security guards held back the crowd as flashbulbs popped. The hum of voices grew louder when Elijah and Naomi appeared. For every camera aimed at them, there were 2 more phones recording from the sidelines. One reporter shouted above the others, "Mr. Carter, is it true the pilot has been terminated permanently?" Elijah didn't slow down. "You'll have all your answers in a few hours," he said evenly, guiding Naomi through the crowd. His composure seemed unshakable. But Naomi noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, the rhythm of controlled anger. At Aurelia's London branch, the staff lined the corridor as the Carters entered. Some greeted them with cautious smiles, others with embarrassment. Naomi could feel the weight of their stares, some sympathetic, some curious, some full of quiet admiration. Inside the main boardroom, cameras and microphones had already been set up for the live broadcast. Clara, Elijah's assistant, handed him a briefing folder. "Everything's prepared, sir. The media outlets are waiting." Elijah nodded, flipping through the pages without really reading them. "And Captain Hale arrived at the disciplinary hearing 2 hours ago," Clara said. "He's cooperating." Naomi felt a small pang in her chest. "What happens to him now?" Elijah glanced at her, then sighed. "That depends on whether he's ready to face what he's done." The conference began precisely at noon. The room was filled with journalists, their voices hushed, cameras rolling. Elijah stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly into the lens. His presence filled the space not loud, but certain, like someone who understood both power and restraint. "Good afternoon," he began, voice calm. "Yesterday, aboard Aurelia Air Flight 907, an incident occurred that has deeply shaken not just this company but many people across the world. A passenger, my daughter, Naomi Carter, was publicly humiliated by a member of our flight crew. Her first-class ticket was torn. her right to dignity challenged, and her safety compromised. That is unacceptable. The room was utterly silent. I founded Aurelia Air to represent more than travel. It was built to represent fairness, respect, and the belief that everyone, no matter their skin, their name, or their seat, deserves dignity in the sky. Yesterday, one of our own forgot that. He paused, letting the words sink in. As of this morning, Captain Richard Hale has been permanently dismissed from his position. His license is being reviewed by aviation authorities. This was not an act of vengeance, but of accountability. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Elijah continued, his tone softening slightly. I also want to say this: not every person in that cabin failed. There were those who stood up when it mattered. A flight attendant, Grace Miller, showed professionalism and courage. A co-pilot, Ethan Lee, demonstrated leadership under pressure. To them, and to every crew member who remembers what compassion looks like, I say thank you. He turned slightly toward Naomi, who sat just off to the side, watching him. And to my daughter, whose strength has reminded me why I started all this. I'm proud of you. Naomi blinked, her throat tightening. Elijah faced the cameras again. We can't undo what happened, but we can choose what happens next, effective immediately. Aurelia Air will implement mandatory bias and empathy training for all staff. We will create a Diversity and Dignity Council, chaired by Dr. Lena Warren, an expert in human rights and aviation, and we will listen to passengers, to employees, to those who have been silenced before. When he finished, there was no applause, just a charged stillness, the kind that follows something honest. A reporter finally asked, "Mr. Carter, do you think this will repair the damage done?" Elijah gave a small, thoughtful smile. No. Repair takes time, but it starts with truth. After the conference, as they walked down the hall, Naomi could hear the murmur of reporters behind them. She glanced at her father. "You were incredible," she said. He chuckled softly. "You make me sound younger than I am." "I mean it. Dad, the way you talked, it made me feel like this wasn't just about me anymore." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's because it never was." Across the city, in a small conference room, Richard Hale sat facing a disciplinary panel. His uniform jacket was gone. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. He looked smaller now, stripped of the authority he had once carried so easily. One of the panelists, a composed woman in her 50s, adjusted her glasses. "Captain Hale, do you have anything to say before we conclude?" He hesitated. Fingers interlocked. "I've spent my life in the air, chasing precision and control. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the people behind the tickets. Yesterday, I tore a piece of paper because I thought it kept order, but it wasn't paper. I tore it with someone's trust." He exhaled shakily. "I can't take back what I did, but I can tell you this: I finally understand why I lost my wings." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the chairwoman said quietly, "Understanding is a start, Captain, but redemption is something you'll have to earn." As he left the room, the flash of cameras outside stung his eyes. A reporter called out, "Do you have anything to say to Naomi Carter?" Hale paused, the cold air brushing his face. "Yes," he said softly, "I see her now." Meanwhile, Naomi and Elijah returned to the hotel. Messages poured in from strangers, pilots, parents, students, each sharing their own story of being dismissed or unseen. Naomi read a few aloud to her father. One said, "My daughter watched your video and told me she wants to fly someday. Thank you for showing her she belongs." Elijah smiled quietly. "That's what I wanted for you, too." Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder. "Maybe now she won't have to go through what I did." He looked out at the fading London skyline, the clouds breaking just enough for light to shine through. "If we're lucky," he said, "your pain will become someone else's permission to rise." Later that night, when Naomi lay in bed scrolling through the latest updates, she saw something that made her stop. A new article headline read, "Aurelia's CEO turns crisis into call for reform." Below, it was a photo of her father at the podium, standing tall, and beside him, her own reflection in the camera's flash. For the first time, she didn't feel exposed. She felt seen, and somewhere across town, in a quiet hotel. Richard Hale packed away his uniform for the last time. He paused before closing the suitcase and looked at the golden wings in his palm. He didn't pin them to his chest. He set them gently on the table. For now, it was enough to carry the weight of what they meant. 2 days after the press conference, the world hadn't stopped talking. On social media, news outlets, and even talk shows, the name Naomi Carter had become more than a headline. It had become a mirror for people's stories, fears, and hopes. Some called her the girl who stayed calm. Others called her the spark that lit the sky. But Naomi herself didn't feel like either. She was just a girl who wanted to go to London and ended up confronting the kind of ugliness her father had spent his life fighting against. The morning sun streamed through the hotel room window, turning everything a soft amber. Naomi sat cross-legged on the couch, still wearing her pajamas, scrolling through messages on her phone. There were thousands, some from strangers offering love, others sharing their own painful experiences. She read one aloud to her father, who was seated nearby reading the financial section of the newspaper. "When I saw what happened to Naomi," she read, "I cried in front of my 10-year-old daughter. I told her that one day people will see her for who she is, not for what she looks like. Thank you for reminding me that strength can be quiet." Elijah lowered his paper, his expression softening. "That's the kind of change that matters. Not the noise, the ripples." Naomi smiled faintly. "It's strange. I didn't do anything heroic. I just didn't fight back." He shook his head. "You refused to become what he wanted you to be: angry, small, or broken. Sometimes grace is the loudest protest." The television hummed in the background. The host of a morning news program was analyzing the aftermath of the incident, showing clips of protests and public forums calling for diversity reform in major airlines. Behind the anchors was a large photo of Elijah and Naomi standing side by side at the press conference. The segment ended with the words, "Aurelia Ayre's response has sparked a broader conversation about equity in corporate leadership." Naomi turned the volume down. "They're making it sound like we planned it all." Elijah chuckled softly. "If only it were that easy." Later that day, Elijah had meetings scheduled with regulators and the newly appointed Diversity and Dignity Council. Naomi decided to walk around the city with Clara, who had offered to show her London beyond the headlines. The air outside smelled faintly of rain, the streets slick and shining. Tourists bustled through Trafalgar Square while pigeons fluttered near the fountains. Naomi wore a simple denim jacket and a baseball cap, trying to blend in. As they crossed the street, a woman approached hesitantly. She was middle-aged, wearing a floral scarf, her voice trembling slightly. "Excuse me, are you Naomi Carter?" Naomi froze for a moment. Yes." The woman smiled tearfully. "My son showed me your story. He's 17, mixed race, always told me he felt invisible. When he saw you, he said, 'She looks like me. Mom, she looks like me and she's not afraid.'" "Thank you." Naomi's throat tightened. I don't know what to say." "You've said it already," the woman replied gently. By standing there, when the woman left, Clara touched Naomi's arm. "You see, the world doesn't remember noise. It remembers courage that looks like stillness." Naomi didn't answer. She was thinking of the moment on the plane, the sound of her ticket tearing, and how powerless she had felt. Yet, somehow, that powerlessness had become something stronger. Across town, in a quiet community center, Richard Hale sat in a small circle of chairs. The walls were plain, the carpet old, the room filled with the soft buzz of fluorescent lights. Around him sat a few other men and women pilots, managers, employees suspended or dismissed from various airlines for misconduct. It was part of a voluntary rehabilitation program initiated by the Aviation Authority, something Elijah Carter himself had advocated for. The facilitator, a calm woman with silver hair, addressed the group. "We're not here to erase what happened. We're here to understand it, to ask why." Hale stared down at his hands. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, finally, his voice cracked the silence. "I thought I was protecting order, that if I questioned every detail, I was keeping people safe. But really, I was protecting my own assumptions." The facilitator nodded, and when those assumptions were challenged, I panicked. Hale admitted, "I wanted to feel in control, but all I did was expose my fear." The woman smiled faintly. "Fear and prejudice share a wall. Captain, you've started knocking it down." Hale exhaled shakily, leaning back in his chair. For the first time, he didn't feel defensive. He felt human. Meanwhile, Elijah's meeting with Dr. Lena Warren was underway in Aurelia's London office. She was a woman in her early 60s, elegant and sharp, known globally for her work on institutional bias. She had a presence that filled the room not by force, but by conviction. "Elijah," she said, adjusting her glasses, "your response was admirable. But we both know this goes deeper than one captain. You're fighting a culture, I know," Elijah said. "That's why I want the council to have full authority to investigate any discriminatory incident, no matter who it involves, including me." Dr. Warren raised an eyebrow. "You're opening yourself up to scrutiny." He nodded. "If I can't be transparent, I can't lead." She smiled approvingly. "Then let's start there." Back at the hotel, Naomi received a message request on her phone. It was from an unknown sender. She hesitated, then opened it. It read, "Miss Carter, this is Richard Hale. I understand if you don't wish to read this, but I wanted to say that I'm sorry not because I lost my job, but because I finally realized what I stole from you. I was wrong. You deserve to fly without proving your worth. I hope someday I can show I've changed, even if you never forgive me." Naomi stared at the message for a long time. Her first instinct was to delete it, to let it vanish like the incident should have. But something inside her stopped her thumb. She set the phone down and breathed deeply. When Elijah returned that evening, he found her sitting on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket. "Long day?" he asked. She nodded. "I got a message from Captain Hale." Elijah hesitated, then sat beside her. "What did he say?" He apologized. It felt different. not like PR. Elijah looked at her carefully. And how did it make you feel? Naomi thought for a long moment. Sad, but not angry anymore. Her father smiled faintly. That means you're healing. They sat quietly, watching the city lights blink on one by one. Below them, the streets of London pulsed with life, each person moving with their own burdens and hopes. Naomi turned to him. Do you ever get tired of fixing things? Elijah laughed softly. Every day. But then I remember, if we don't, who will? She leaned her head on his shoulder. Maybe I'll help you fix them one day. You already have, he said. The next morning, Elijah's reforms hit every major news outlet. Other airlines announced they would follow Aurelia's example, creating their own bias review boards and staff education programs. The ripple had become a wave. In Chicago, Grace Miller received a letter from headquarters thanking her for her actions on Flight 907 and offering her a promotion to senior flight trainer. She smiled as she folded the letter, whispering to herself, finally, they're listening, there, and in his small apartment near the coast. Richard Hale watched the same announcement on TV. For the first time in years, he didn't feel bitter watching someone else rise. He turned off the television, looked out at the ocean, and whispered, She deserved the sky more than I ever did. Back in London, Naomi opened her email to find an invitation from her school's debate organization. They wanted her to give a short talk at an upcoming event titled Voices That Change the Conversation. She laughed softly, reading the message aloud to her father. Seems like they found the right voice. Elijah said, Maybe. Naomi replied, But I think the conversation's only just starting. And for the first time since that flight, Naomi Carter smiled, not the nervous, uncertain smile from the headlines, but a genuine, fearless one. The kind that belonged to someone who had faced the sky, been broken by it, and chosen to rise anyway. The weeks after the incident passed in a blur of movement and meaning. Naomi Carter returned to New York with her father, though nothing about their lives felt quite the same. Cameras still followed them at airports. Reporters still tried to capture quotes. But the frenzy was slowly giving way to something deeper dialogue. All across the country, people were talking about fairness in the skies, about representation in leadership, about the quiet power of standing tall without shouting. Naomi had become a reluctant figurehead. She didn't chase attention, but attention seemed to find her anyway. Schools reached out, asking her to speak. Universities wanted her to write about her experience. Even television networks offered interviews. Elijah let her decide. You don't owe anyone your pain, he told her one evening as they sat in their kitchen, the soft light of the city flickering beyond the window. I know, she said, stirring her tea absently, but if sharing it helps someone else, maybe it's worth it. He smiled. Then do it your way. When she finally agreed to one interview, a quiet, sit-down conversation for a public television segment, she asked for one condition. No makeup crew, no bright lights, no rehearsed questions. She wanted it to feel like a real conversation, not a spectacle. The host, a gentlewoman named Diane Cole, respected that. The interview aired live one calm Thursday evening. Naomi wore a simple white blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back loosely. Her voice trembled a little at first, but as she spoke, confidence built with every sentence. I didn't set out to make a statement. She said, I just wanted to get where I was going. But when someone tells you that you don't belong, and you choose not to shrink, that's when the statement makes itself. Diane leaned forward. And now you've inspired millions of people. How does that feel?" Naomi smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. "It feels heavier than I expected, but maybe it's a good kind of weight, because it means people care. It means they're watching and maybe listening. Back home." Elijah watched from the living room, his hand resting against his chin. Grace Miller, now in her new role as senior flight trainer, called him during the broadcast. "She's remarkable," Grace said. "She always has been." Elijah replied softly, "The world's just catching up." Grace laughed gently. "You raised her well." "I tried," he said, his eyes never leaving the screen. In the days that followed, applications to Aurelia Air skyrocketed, especially among young women and people of color. The company became a symbol of reform, its new Diversity and Dignity Council drawing international attention. Airlines that once ignored the conversation were now calling for consultations with Dr. Lena Warren. But Elijah knew that transformation didn't happen with press releases. It happened quietly, through people like Grace, like Ethan Lee, like every worker who decided to see instead of assume. He made it a habit to walk through headquarters every morning, speaking to new trainees, asking them not about numbers, but about their values. One morning, he found Grace leading a training session. She was standing in front of a group of recruits, explaining not just procedures, but purpose. "You're not just serving passengers," she said. "You're carrying their stories. You're the first face they see when they leave the ground, and, sometimes, the last when they land. Make it count." When she noticed Elijah at the doorway, she smiled. "You came to check on us, didn't you?" He stepped forward, folding his hands behind his back, just making sure the future of Aurelia Skies is in good hands. One of the young trainees, a tall man with warm brown skin and bright eyes, raised his hand. "Mr. Carter, is it true your daughter changed the airline?" Elijah chuckled. "No," he said. "She reminded us what it means to fly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city." Richard Hale sat at a coffee shop near the coast, a notebook open in front of him. He'd started attending community workshops on bias awareness and ethics in aviation. It wasn't part of any official sentence, he simply needed to understand what had gone wrong inside him. He no longer wore the crisp pilot's uniform he once took pride in. His clothes were simple now, unremarkable. But in his face there was a quiet transformation, lines of arrogance softened into humility. He had been writing letters to different people he'd wronged during his career. Some never replied. Others sent brief acknowledgments. But the act itself brought him peace. That morning, he wrote a final one, not to Naomi, but to Elijah. "Mr. Carter," it began. "I will never forget the sound of your voice that day, calm, firm, and unyielding. You could have humiliated me in front of the world, but instead, you held me accountable without hatred. That taught me something about leadership and humanity. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I've learned, I've changed, and I'm trying to help others do the same." He sealed the letter, stamped it, and placed it in the nearest postbox. A week later, Elijah opened it in his office. He read it twice before setting it down. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled faintly and whispered, "Maybe people can change after all." Naomi was back at school by then, trying to settle into normal life. But normal felt different now. During lunch breaks, classmates would approach her not to gossip, but to ask for advice, to tell her she'd inspired them. One girl admitted she'd started a petition for racial equity in their debate league because of Naomi's story. "I just figured," the girl said shyly. "If you could stand up there and face that kind of thing, maybe I can speak up too." Naomi laughed softly. "Just don't forget to breathe first." At home, Elijah received an invitation to speak at a leadership summit in Washington, D.C. He agreed, but on one condition: that Naomi accompany him and say a few words herself. She was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed. On the day of the event, the hall was filled with business leaders, educators, and students. Elijah spoke first, his voice steady and resolute. "Leadership," he said, "isn't about titles or uniforms. It's about seeing others as fully human, especially when it's inconvenient." When it was Naomi's turn, she took the stage slowly. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone, but her gaze was clear. "People tell me I was brave," she began. "But bravery doesn't always feel like bravery. Sometimes it feels like just trying not to fall apart." She paused, scanning the audience. "What I learned is that silence protects comfort, not justice. And justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone decides enough is enough." The crowd rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the hall. That night, as they walked out into the cool air, Elijah looked at his daughter and said, "You've got your mother's fire." Naomi smiled, glancing up at the stars. "And your patience." He laughed softly. "I'll take that." Months later, Aurelia Air unveiled a new initiative, the Naomi Carter Scholarship for Diversity in Aviation, designed to fund training for underrepresented youth who dreamed of becoming pilots, engineers, or airline leaders. The program's motto was engraved on a plaque at the headquarters: "Fly with dignity, land with purpose." At the ceremony, Naomi stood beside her father, smiling as cameras flashed, not because she sought attention, but because she finally understood what her story meant. It wasn't just hers anymore, and somewhere far away, on a quiet coastal morning. Richard Hale watched the news coverage of the scholarship ceremony. He smiled faintly and whispered, "She got her sky back." As Naomi looked out from the stage that day, she thought of everyone who had been part of her journey. Grace, Ethan, Dr. Warren, even Hale. Every one of them had carried a piece of the story. She took a deep breath, the kind that fills your chest with gratitude and possibility. Her father leaned close and whispered, "Ready for takeoff?" Naomi grinned. "Always." The audience rose in applause once more as the banner behind them fluttered gently in the breeze, blue letters glowing beneath the lights, "Wings of Tomorrow." It wasn't just the name of the scholarship. It was the promise of everything yet to come. It was nearly a year after Flight 907, yet the world still spoke of it as if it had just happened. Naomi Carter had long since returned to her studies, but her name had grown beyond a single incident. It had become part of a larger story about dignity and change. The scholarship she helped launch had already funded dozens of aspiring pilots and engineers, many of whom sent her handwritten letters, calling her their sky sister. She kept those letters in a wooden box by her bed, opening them whenever the weight of attention grew too heavy. Life for the Carters had found a strange new rhythm. Elijah was busier than ever, traveling between continents to implement Aurelia Air's global reform programs. But every Sunday, no matter which time zone he was in, he called Naomi. Sometimes they talked about work, sometimes about nothing at all, what books they were reading, what coffee she'd tried that week. Those conversations grounded him. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elijah stood on the tarmac of Aurelia's newest training facility in Atlanta. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and wet asphalt after a morning drizzle. Rows of young cadets stood proudly in uniform, ready to begin their first day of training under the Diversity in Aviation program. Cameras lined the back of the hangar as Elijah prepared to speak. He glanced at the crowd, his gaze lingering on the mix of faces: black, white, Asian, Latino, male, female, and non-binary. It was a portrait of the new Aurelia, one that looked like the world itself. "When I founded Aurelia Air," he began, his voice carrying across the hangar, "I thought I was building an airline. But somewhere along the way, I realized we were building something bigger, a community in the sky, and communities only thrive when everyone has a place." The audience nodded, quiet but moved. Grace Miller, now in charge of the entire Global Crew Training Division, stood proudly beside him. Her uniform carried new insignia, small wings trimmed in gold, a symbol of the program she had helped shape. When Elijah finished, he stepped down from the podium and handed Grace the microphone. "Now," he said, smiling, "I think it's time the next generation hears from the woman who taught me half of what I know." Grace laughed softly before addressing the new recruits. "You'll learn how to serve food, manage passengers, and navigate turbulence," she said. "But what I hope you remember most is this: every passenger carries a story you cannot see. Treat them as though it's the most important one you'll ever hear." Applause filled the hangar. Elijah's eyes shimmered with quiet pride. For a moment, he imagined Amara, his late wife, watching from somewhere, smiling that soft, knowing smile she'd had when Naomi was born. That night, Elijah returned to his hotel and sat by the window, looking out at the runways bathed in golden floodlights. He thought about the year that had passed, the anger, the reforms, the healing. He still received criticism, of course. Some accused him of performative activism. Others claimed he'd changed the company too much, too fast. But when he thought of Naomi and the faces of those new cadets, the noise didn't matter. Across the country, Naomi was preparing for something new. Her school's debate team had been invited to represent the United States at an international youth forum in Geneva. It was the same event she'd missed the year before, the one she'd been traveling to on Flight 907. The invitation felt poetic, almost like fate offering her another chance to finish what she'd started. Elijah was proud, though slightly anxious. "You sure you're ready for the world stage again?" he asked with a teasing smile as he helped her pack. Naomi grinned. "I survived viral fame and high school finals. Dad, I think I'll be okay." Before she left, Elijah handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a pin shaped like tiny wings, the same symbol worn by Aurelia's new trainees. "For luck," he said. She looked at it for a long moment, her throat tightening. "For courage," she corrected softly. Her flight to Geneva was calm, almost unnervingly so. No stares, no whispers, just the quiet hum of engines and the faint scent of coffee drifting through the cabin. When the captain's voice came over the intercom, Naomi froze for a split second. His tone, gentle and measured, reminded her of that day. "Good afternoon. Passengers, this is Captain Ethan Lee speaking. We're cruising at 37,000 feet. On behalf of Aurelia Air, thank you for trusting us with your journey." Naomi smiled to herself. It was him, the co-pilot from Flight 907. He'd been promoted to captain just months earlier. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of poetry. After landing in Geneva, Naomi stood by the terminal window, watching the sunset stain the clouds with orange and violet streaks. For the first time, she didn't feel fear or memory. She felt peace. The conference was held in an old glass-domed auditorium surrounded by gardens. Students from 50 countries filled the seats. When it was her turn to speak, Naomi walked to the podium, her palms slightly sweaty, her voice steady. "My name is Naomi Carter," she began, "and last year I learned something about the world and about myself. I learned that silence is comfortable, but it never changes anything. And I learned that even when your voice shakes, it can still move mountains." She paused, scanning the audience. "When people ask me what happened on that flight, I tell them this: it wasn't a story about hate. It was a story about sight. One man couldn't see me for who I was, and because of that, he lost his place in the sky. But hundreds of others learned to see better because of it, and that's what matters." Her words drew thunderous applause. Students from different countries stood, clapping and cheering. Some even chanted her name. Naomi smiled but didn't bask in the attention. She simply nodded once, humbly, before stepping down. Later that night, she received a call from her father. "I saw your speech," Elijah said, pride warm in his voice. Naomi laughed. "Already, it just ended." "Naomi, the internet moves faster than planes," he teased. Then his tone softened. "Your mother would have been proud. You've turned pain into purpose." She looked out at the Geneva skyline, twinkling like a net of stars. "I just told the truth," she said quietly. The rest happened on its own. Back in Atlanta, Grace Miller finished another day of training when she received a package from Elijah. Inside was a plaque engraved with her name and the words, "For showing the world that compassion is the highest altitude." She smiled and hung it on the wall above her desk. And somewhere near the coast, Richard Hale continued to mentor former aviation employees through ethics workshops. He'd never returned to flying, but that no longer bothered him. He often told his students, "You don't need wings to rise, you just need to look up." One evening, as he left the classroom, he noticed a framed photo hanging on the wall, a still from Naomi's speech in Geneva. Her hands lifted mid-gesture, her face serene. Beneath it was a quote she'd given to a journalist. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from what tried to ground you." Hale stood there for a long moment, his eyes glistening. He whispered, "Thank you, kid," before turning off the lights. The next morning, as the sun rose over cities and airports across the world, planes bearing Aurelia's logo lifted into the sky. Passengers settled into seats without realizing they were part of something bigger. A quiet revolution born from a torn ticket and a girl who refused to shrink. In New York, Naomi woke early, her alarm chiming softly. She opened the curtains and watched a silver jet streak through the morning light. For the first time, she didn't think of the past. She thought of tomorrow, the stories still unwritten, the lives still unseen, and the endless sky that held them all. She pinned the small velvet wings to her blazer, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Time to fly." The sky, it seemed, remembered her name. Spring came early that year. The cherry trees in Central Park bloomed before their time, scattering pale pink petals that floated down like quiet confetti. Naomi Carter loved walking there in the mornings before the world fully woke, when the city's hum was soft enough to hear the birds between passing taxis. A year and a half had passed since that day on Flight 907, yet its echoes still rippled through her life, not as pain now, but as purpose. She had just turned 18 and was preparing to leave for college in the fall. Her acceptance letter from Columbia University sat pinned to the refrigerator door. She was planning to major in sociology, focusing on equity and human behavior in modern institutions. "You're still flying," her father had said with a proud grin when she told him her choice, just at a different altitude. That morning, Elijah joined her on their usual park walk. The sun was barely up, and his scarf trailed loosely around his neck as they crossed the path lined with blooming trees. "You've been quiet lately," he said. Naomi smiled faintly. "Just thinking. Everything feels peaceful, but part of me wonders if that peace means I've done enough." Elijah glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Peace isn't the absence of work, Naomi. It's the balance between doing and being. You've done plenty." She looked down at the gravel path. "Maybe, but sometimes I feel like the story still follows me more than I follow it." He laughed softly. "That's because the world rarely forgets the stories that remind it to do better. You gave people a compass. Let them use it." They stopped by the lake, watching the reflection of the skyline shimmer across the water. Naomi's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Grace Miller. "Need a favor, young lady. Can you speak at our new academy's graduation next month? The first class of Aurelia's diversity program is ready for their wings." Naomi grinned. "She still calls me young lady." Elijah chuckled. "You should be honored. Grace doesn't call anyone that affectionately." A month later, Naomi stood backstage at the Aurelia Air Academy in Atlanta. The auditorium was alive with excitement, families waving flags, cadets in crisp uniforms lined in neat rows. On the stage beside the podium stood a massive banner, "First Graduating Class, Wings of Tomorrow." Grace found her there, adjusting her headset, looking exactly as Naomi remembered her, poised, confident, eyes full of quiet warmth. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Naomi replied. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't overthink it. Just speak from where it hurts and where it healed." Naomi smiled. "That's the only place I know how to speak from." When her name was announced, the crowd erupted in applause. She walked onto the stage, heart steady but full. Before her stood 200 graduates, men and women of every color and background, all beaming with pride. She let the moment breathe before she spoke. "Good afternoon," she began. "I was told I should come here and inspire you, but I think you've already done that yourselves. You are the proof that skies can change." She paused, letting her words sink in. "When I was 17, I boarded a plane expecting an ordinary flight. It became anything but. In that moment, I realized that sometimes life gives us turbulence so we remember how to steer. And I learned something else: what you choose to do after the storm matters more than the storm itself." A hush fell over the audience. "You're stepping into an industry that will ask you for precision, strength, and calm," she continued. "But it will also ask for something harder: to be kind when others aren't. To stand up when silence is easier. That's how you earn your real wings." As she finished, the audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering. Grace wiped a tear discreetly from her eye. Elijah, seated in the front row, simply smiled and pressed his hand to his chest. After the ceremony, Naomi mingled with the graduates. One young man approached her shyly. Miss Carter, I just wanted to say thank you. I watched your interview last year when I was deciding whether to apply. I almost didn't thought people like me didn't belong up there, but you changed that." Naomi shook his hand firmly. "Promise me one thing," she said. "When you're in the sky, see people before you see passengers." He nodded, his smile wide and sincere. Later that evening, as the celebration quieted, Elijah and Naomi joined Grace, Ethan Lee, and Dr. Lena Warren in a small garden outside the academy. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the warm air. The conversation was light at first about work, travel, and the chaos of modern airports, but it soon turned reflective. Dr. Warren lifted her glass. "To change," she said, "the kind that sticks." Ethan nodded, and, to second chances, Grace glanced at Elijah. "Speaking of which, I heard from Richard Hale last week." Naomi froze slightly. "Really?" Grace nodded. "He's been mentoring our new ethics instructors. He's good at it, humble, honest. You can tell he's still carrying that day, but he's carrying it differently now." Naomi let out a slow breath. "That's good. I think we all needed to carry it differently." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't feel empty. The sound of distant music drifted from the main hall. Fireflies blinked in the grass. Elijah turned to Naomi. "You know, your mother would have loved this. She always said change should look like celebration, not punishment." Naomi smiled faintly. "I think she'd be proud of you, too." He looked down at his drink. "Maybe we both made her proud in our own ways." As the night deepened, Grace excused herself to check on the staff, and Dr. Warren followed to make her rounds. That left Elijah and Naomi sitting quietly beneath the lanterns. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked. He chuckled. "Every day. But lately, I'm starting to think the best leaders are the ones who make themselves unnecessary. When Aurelia doesn't need me anymore, that's when I'll know I did my job." Naomi tilted her head. "Then, what?" He smiled. "Then, maybe I'll just travel. Not for work, just to remember what flying feels like when you're not in charge of the sky." She laughed softly. "You and me both." The following morning, as they prepared to leave Atlanta, Naomi stood by the terminal window watching an Aurelia jet lift into the clouds. The rising sun painted the fuselage in gold. For a moment, she pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the vibration of engines somewhere deep inside her chest. She didn't know exactly what the future held: college, advocacy, perhaps even a return to aviation one day. But she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't afraid of turbulence anymore. It wasn't the shaking that defined her. It was how she kept her balance when it came. As they boarded their flight back to New York, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Welcome aboard. Our journey today is short, but meaningful. And as always, we're honored to carry you safely home." Naomi recognized that voice. Grace had told her Ethan Lee now piloted this route regularly. She smiled, closing her eyes as the plane began to move. The world outside blurred into streaks of light. Clouds opened like soft gates to the sky. She thought about how far they'd all come from the day her ticket was torn to this moment of quiet ascent. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, as though forgiveness itself had learned to fly. When they reached cruising altitude, Elijah looked at her from across the aisle and said quietly, "You know, Naomi, the sky never forgets the ones who dared to change it." Naomi looked out the window, her reflection merging with the endless blue beyond. "Maybe," she said softly, but sometimes it's not about changing the sky. It's about remembering we all belong in it. The plane leveled out, steady and serene. The seatbelt sign dimmed. Somewhere far below, cities pulsed with light, and the earth turned quietly toward another dawn. Naomi leaned back, her thoughts a calm current of gratitude and peace. She touched the small silver wings pinned to her jacket, feeling the weight and warmth of everything they represented: pain, courage, forgiveness, and hope. The engines hummed like a heartbeat. Outside the window, a trail of sunlight followed them through the clouds, as if the horizon itself were reaching forward to greet her. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi Carter didn't think of the past, or the fame, or even the lesson. She simply whispered to herself, with a soft smile, "We made it." The sky, wide and forgiving, answered with silence and light. The story of Naomi Carter offers profound lessons that resonate far beyond a single flight. At its core, it demonstrates that true courage is quiet but unyielding, standing firm in one's dignity even when the world seems stacked against you. It reminds us that prejudice often stems from assumptions and fear, and the only way to challenge it is through clarity, integrity, and measured response. Naomi's journey shows that power and influence, when combined with moral responsibility, can create systemic change, transforming institutions from the inside out. For older audiences, it underscores the importance of mentorship, empathy, and advocacy, reminding us that supporting younger generations in moments of injustice leaves a legacy far greater than personal accolades. The story also highlights accountability, not only for those who commit wrongs but for the leaders who shape culture, illustrating that addressing bias and creating inclusive spaces requires intentional action. Most importantly, it teaches that even in the face of humiliation or disappointment, one's response defines the narrative, and standing for justice can inspire lasting, meaningful change in society. Thank you for watching this incredible story unfold. If Naomi's journey inspired you, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Your support helps us bring more real-life lessons and emotional journeys to everyone.